There's a problem that we have in society, and I think a lot of economics has missed this problem. A lot of economics has directed itself towards the problem of optimization. So we act as if we're just, as economists, and my PhD is in economics, we act as if the problem is to optimize the location and use of resources. And Eugen von Bauwerk, a lot of Austrians would say the way we should think about this is that economics is a social process that we use to discover the value of the resources in the first place. We need to invert the whole process. So if you think about an exchange, there's two people involved. It's social. And it's not clear what the price is going to be. It's not clear whether we're going to exchange at all. We have to negotiate. We have to come up with some rules. And so it struck me, and I have to say I follow in this book the lead of James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in 1986, who introduced, I mean, his definition of public choice, and I know most of you know it, but just briefly let me say his definition of public choice had three parts. The first is methodological individualism. We take people both as a philosophical matter to be autonomous, but we also think of them practically as individual decision makers. And so a group of autonomous people, in order to get them to act as a group, you have to get their consent. The second thing that public choice represents is what Buchanan called behavioral symmetry. So individuals acting in the market have certain motivations and certain levels of information. They don't become more moral or smarter when they enter the voting booth or enter political office. They still are basically the same people. It's the third that Buchanan emphasized that this book tries to capture, and that is what Buchanan called politics as exchange. Politics as exchange means that we need to understand the institutions for working together in groups. Let me give an example. So let's suppose that I advertise my services as a roofer, someone who puts on roofs. And Caleb needs a new roof. We agree that I'll put a new roof on his house for $5,000. He gives me $1,000 in advance to go and buy shingles. As soon as I get the $1,000, I do the dance of victory. Ha ha, I've got your $1,000, I'm not giving it back. Well, unless we have some mechanism for enforcing that contract, he probably wouldn't have given me the $1,000 in the first place. So some resort to something like coercion to enforce contracts is necessary for liberty. Some ability to be coerced is necessary for liberty. I cannot write binding contracts unless we have some third party to enforce the contract. Now, it doesn't have to be the state. It may be that we hired a big, smart dog. It's not real smart, it's a dog. But a big, smart dog that will bite whoever violates the terms of the contract. So coercion is a part of liberty. Without that, we could not possibly be able to write binding contracts. So let's suppose instead of a new roof, our problem is mosquitoes. So in our neighborhood, there's too many mosquitoes. And we all agree that behind each of our houses, there's some mud holes and some old tires that have water in them. All of us agree that we'll fill in the mud holes as long as the EPA doesn't find out. And we'll get rid of the tires that have water in them that are the place for mosquitoes to grow. And we'll agree that anyone who doesn't do that will be subject to a fine. And we all sign a contract that agrees to be subject to coercion if we violate the terms of that agreement. Now, if anybody doesn't, there'll probably be almost as many mosquitoes as before. So we have someone go around, and anyone who violates the terms of this contract gets fined. They get punished. But because we gave actual consent, that group is able to achieve something that no individual could have achieved, and that is control of mosquitoes. There are many examples, and the Lewis and Clark example, that is all of them choosing a place to stay over the winter of 1805, 1806, they had to be able to choose in a group. They couldn't have said, you know, let's split up. We'll all go live separately. They all would have been picked off by hostile Indians, by weather. They couldn't have survived. So social groups, nonprofits, all sorts of groups that constitute themselves by a set of rules, oblige themselves either to obey or to be coerced. And so the sort of the paradox, I think, is pretty easily resolved. Under some circumstances that involve actual consent, coercion is necessary for liberty. And that's true even for groups, was Buchanan's fundamental insight.
So when you speak of, you're using this term, actual consent. So how does the concept of actual consent inform the notion of politics that you describe in the book, and how does that differ from typical notions of politics?
Well, the usual notion of politics that we have is a mythological or maybe just tacit consent to something called a social contract. And I have to give Jean-Jacques Rousseau credit. He asked a really great question in his book, The Social Contract. He said, how can a man be both free and yet bound by wills not his own? How can a man be both free and yet bound by wills not his own? That's a terrific question. Now, I think his answer went completely off the tracks. In his answer, he conjured a genie called the general will. And the general will was what the group of people actually wanted. And then the group of people would use voting procedures to figure out what that was, and they would do it more or less perfectly. And anyone who disagreed with what the group decided was guilty of treason. Because what it means for the group to decide what the general will is, if I disagree, I am mistaken. So if I resist, I'll be sent either to a prison camp or an insane asylum, and the distinction is hard to make. But still, Rousseau's question, how can a man be both free and yet bound by wills not his own, is correct. The way that a group of people solve this problem is we know that we may disagree about outcomes. We know that we may disagree about outcomes. So what do we decide on? We can come up with an agreement on rules. So Buchanan's claim is people choosing in groups don't choose outcomes. People choosing in groups choose rules. But then you are bound to accept the outcome so long as the rules are followed. That's what politics means. What politics means is a group of people discuss, argue, follow the rules, and then make a decision. I am bound to accept the outcome because I agreed with the rules. But it requires actual consent. It requires an actual contractual agreement. So groups that constitute themselves, a club, Buchanan famously came up with clubs theory. So the private pools, private tennis clubs, they have rules that govern whether or not, what do you have to dress. So Wimbledon in London is a private club, and they have rules for how you can dress. There were several people this past week, I was in London and Wimbledon was going on, some players actually had to go change their clothes. They didn't agree with that, but the rule was, in order to play here, this is what you have to do. If you don't agree with it, you can go play somewhere else. So what I mean by politics is we choose a set of rules, we have to accept the outcome so long as the rules are followed. That coercive understanding that I accept the outcome is actually necessary for me to be able to participate in the group in the first place.
So you remind me of a situation that I've often found myself in, I'm sure you have, which is where you're splitting a sandwich and the rule is I cut, you pick, or vice versa. It's self-reinforcing. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. It encourages everybody to essentially deal fairly, and you can use it over and over and over again. But that's a one-time thing. For the purposes of getting to that end, the group only exists for the length of time of that transaction. So if you're talking about a politics that requires some sort of affirmative consent, what does that mean for a state? What does that mean for governments that have existed long before any of us have existed, and yet demands that we obey the laws that we didn't sign up for?
I think that's the thing that's sort of unsatisfying about this analysis, because my claims, which rest on actual rather than tacit consent, don't tell us much about our obligations of the state or the political authority that the state has over us. So this book, in a way, is kind of agnostic about that. What it does offer is some ways the technical parts of it are a way of representing individual preferences and to try to simulate how it is that a group of people might make a decision. So if you're a committee, if you're the U.S. Congress, how might this group choose a set of rules and then make decisions? The obligations and the justification of a state is something bigger because it's larger. So if you're a congressional committee, we would choose a set of rules. We can change those rules, but I can't say at the end I don't like the outcome, so I refuse to accept it. Your question about the authority of the state, I think this book, this approach is agnostic about. I don't think we can justify states with actual consent because people have not consented. And another condition is being able to secede, being able to leave, and that's not something that states are very good at either. Whereas if I live in a neighborhood and I don't agree with what the neighborhood association has done, I can sell my house and go somewhere else. If I move in and I know of the rules that the neighborhood association has, I'm implicitly accepting those, but that's because I had other alternative choices. So that the problem of tacit consent is one that David Hume famously addressed. And he said this sort of social contract arrangement, this idea that by living in a country, I am consenting to its laws, is like saying I was blindfolded and dragged onto a ship against my will, and we get 100 leagues out to sea, and you say, well, you're either bound by the captain's rules or you can jump overboard. Well, I can't swim through 100 leagues of shark-infested water, but that doesn't mean that I consented to the captain's rules. I can't use my consent then as a justification for political authority. What are the other justifications we might use for political authority? My approach doesn't say anything about that. It's not clear you can justify political authority. I'm not saying you can't, but I don't think you can justify political authority with actual consent unless people have a fairly easy way to leave, to secede, and take their belongings with them.
So you also point out that in the example that you use with Lewis and Clark, that the fact that this group was operating not as a dictatorship for some time period when trying to arrive at this very important decision, what do you view as the most important uses of choosing in groups, and what are the things that a politics with consent can produce that maybe markets can't?
One of the things that we rely on institutions to do is to help groups of people capture the gains from cooperation and specialization. Now, there are some settings, and we call them markets, where the exchange of money and commodities and services actually work pretty well on a bilateral basis, or maybe something that's larger, where we have a contract where we all work for the same corporation. But there are many kinds of provisions of public goods or memberships in an organization like a city where each of us is acting as an equal, and within it, we each are having certain rights that we're hoping to be able to take advantage of memberships of being in the city, being in a tennis club, something like that. We are relying on the group to provide us with certain benefits from that kind of cooperation. If the other members of the group try to exploit us by changing the rules, either we can reject the change in the rules we didn't consent to, or we can leave the group without having to forfeit all of the wealth and belongings that we have. So the question that you ask is a difficult one. Lewis and Clark the reason we use this example, Lewis and Clark were a military unit. And throughout the time that Lewis and Clark had been the leaders of this military unit, if someone had acted against their authority or had failed in their obligations as a member of a military unit, they were punished. One guy received 100 lashes on his bare back, divided into 4 groups of 25. It almost killed him, but that's because he had fallen asleep on watch, which is something that normally might be punished by execution. So if anything, they were showing clemency by only giving him 100 lashes. So what's interesting is that in this instance, in deciding where to spend this winter, Lewis and Clark, the captains, suspended their normal military authority and asked the members of the Corps of Discovery to vote. Why? Why would they do that? There's two usual explanations that were given, and I think this gets to the core of your answer for why we would want to do this in the first place, rather than just have a hierarchy. And those two things are, first, information. Now, we think of markets as being a way of generating prices that provide information about relative scarcities, but there's some circumstances where property rights are not specified in such a way that prices can give us that discovery process. Voting is a discovery process. Voting is a political discovery process that's analogous to, and in some circumstances superior to, and that's why people use it. That sort of collective decision-making can, under some circumstances, be quite useful. And so there have been writings about the wisdom of crowds, and the example that we use in the book that some of you may remember in the game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which was the most useful, the best of the lifelines. Well, the best of the lifelines was ask the audience. And remember, these were people who had stood in line for 4 hours to sit in the audience of a television show that they could have seen better if they'd stayed home and watched on TV. So these are not necessarily society's winners. But if you asked which of these 4 alternatives is the best, almost always the largest plurality of these not society's winners were correct. Is it A, B, C, or D? Is that the right answer? Well, as a group, they were better than choosing any one of the individuals would have been by themselves. So Lewis and Clark were trying to get all the information they could about a difficult decision where it wasn't clear what the right choice was, but the consequences of being wrong would have been catastrophic. They all would have died. The second is legitimacy. If we feel like we've all had a voice, and it turns out that I get to say, no, I think we should stay on the north side of the river, and other people hear my argument. I have a full and fair chance to persuade them, and yet they are not persuaded. I'm much more likely to accept the outcome as being one that I support than if it was just imposed and I never even had a chance to give voice to what my objections were. So information and legitimacy are the way that we often choose in groups using politics, and I would say it's a Coercion argument again. I'm not sure that you could predict ex ante that it's as useful as it turns out to be, but that's the way almost all groups choose, and the ones that choose that way and that follow the rules give people the impression that the following of the rules is important, that it has this kind of moral force on its own, are more likely to survive and succeed.